but it's very new to me. So there was once a king and a queen, and they were so in love that their love took form. 7 handsome sons and a daughter. But that last child, that daughter, she was too much for the queen, and the queen, with a smile and a sigh, died in the arms of the king. And the king's grief could not be contained. Every night, every day, he wept. And finally, when he had run out of tears, he began to go out. He would mount his horse and go out into the forest, and he would wander in the forest for hours. No one knew what to do. He ignored his children. He ignored his kingdom. Every day, he would get on a horse and go into the forest. One day he went into the forest, and on the path was a tangle of twig. And when the king's horse stepped on that tangle of twig, they were lost. The forest grew denser and denser around the king. So dense were the trees that he could not tell when the sun set and the moon rose. He rode in the darkness, not sure of where he was, until he saw a light. Praise be a light, he thought. I'm saved. And he headed for the light, and there, in a clearing, was a cottage. And he got off his horse and he went up to the door, and the door was opened by an old woman. Your Majesty, she said, you are lost. Yes, said the king, I'm lost. Can you show me the way back to my castle? And the old woman said, oh, yes. But only if you marry my daughter. And the king was startled, but there was a motion in the cottage, and through the door came a young woman, and she was beautiful. She was a woman to make any man's heart beat faster. She was a woman to warm the blood. Except there was something. The king was not quite sure. He was not sure of anything except that he was lost. So he said yes. And he took the young woman up behind him on his horse, and her arms wrapped around him, and the cold struck him in his heart. And with that cold came fear for his children. On the way back to the castle, he made his plan. He arrived at dawn, and his servants rejoiced, for they thought he was lost forever. He brought the young woman into the castle, and he turned her over to his servants and said, give her anything she wants. We are to be married. Give her anything she desires. And with this, he distracted her long enough that he could hide his children. He took his 7 sons and his daughter deep into the forest to a tower, and there he sheltered them, for he was afraid. He was afraid of his new wife. He was afraid of his children's new mother. So he did not tell her. But every day, the king would go and visit his children. And every day, the queen would wonder where he had gone. And finally, one day she followed him, and she discovered where he had been hiding his children. And she planned to remove them. So the next day, before the king left the castle, the queen mounted her horse and went into the woods. And when the children heard the sound of the horse coming through the woods, the boys, all 7 of them, raced out of the tower to greet their father. But the daughter was up in the tower looking out the window, and she saw that it was not her father who came, but their stepmother. And she saw the stepmother cast something over her 7 brothers, and where those 7 sturdy boys had stood, there were 7 wild geese. And the geese gave great cries, and they took off into the sky. And the young girl, the princess in the tower, she hid. And the queen did not see her. When the king arrived at the tower, he found only his daughter. When his daughter told him of what had happened, the king determined to bring her back to the castle. And he rode back to the castle with his daughter in front of him. And when he reached the castle, he looked at the queen and he said, "What happens to my daughter happens to you." And in this way, he protected her. At least until she was about 13 years old. And the queen began to look at her and envy her. The princess, she was smart. She saw the way her stepmother looked at her, and she thought perhaps now would be a good time. And so, in the night, she packed what little she could, and she left the castle, for her quest was to find her brothers. She traveled a long way. She walked through the woods, she crossed the rivers. She went from drinking water from stores she had brought with her to drinking water out of streams, from eating bread from a bag to eating berries from a bush. And finally, deep in the woods, she found a cottage on the edge of a lake. And she went inside, and there was bread and fruit on the table, and she was so hungry that she took a piece of bread, and then she heard a noise outside, and she hid under the table, and into the cottage came 7 wild geese. But they were wild geese for a moment only, for as the sun set, 7 young men stood there around the table. The princess flew out from beneath and said, "My brothers, I have come to save you." And the brothers said, "Our sister, we are happy to see you, but you cannot save us. There is no way you can free us." And the princess said, "But there must be something. You must let me try." They said, "You are too late. Tomorrow morning we will fly south so that we can spend the winter someplace where it is warm. You cannot fly with us, and we can only do the trip in 2 days. Halfway across the ocean there is a small rock in the middle of the sea, just big enough for all of us to stand overnight. It is the only thing that saves us from plunging into the sea and drowning." But the young princess, she begged and she pleaded. And finally the brothers decided that they would do what they could, and with the help of the princess, who was a weaver of some note, they wove a net. And in the morning when the sun came up and the brothers turned back into wild geese, the princess climbed into the net, and the geese lifted her in the net and flew out over the sea. All day they flew, their wings beating in the air. All day they flew, and beneath them was the sea, gray and cold. All day they flew, and the sun went from low to high to low again. And they flew, still they flew, searching for that rock in the middle of the sea. And just before the sun went down over the edge of the horizon, the geese dove out of the sky toward the water. And there was the stone, just big enough, barely above the water, and just big enough to hold them all. If they stood all night long with their sister in their arms. In the morning when the sun came up, the geese lifted the princess once again, and they flew. And that night, they landed on a land that was full of fruit trees, and it was green and fragrant. They took their sister, the young princess, the geese. They took their sister to a cave in the hills, and there she rested while the young men sat and protected her. And her last thought before she closed her eyes was that there would be some way that she could save her brothers. That night she had a dream. And in her dream, a woman appeared to her and said, "You can break the enchantment that imprisons your brothers. In the back of this cave there are nettles. Crush the nettles in your hands until they are soft enough to weave. Weave 7 shirts for your 7 brothers. And once those shirts are made, the enchantment will be broken and your brothers will be free. But be very certain. For once you begin this task, you may not speak or utter a sound until the task is done, else your brothers will be geese forever." The young girl woke up. She went to the back of the cave and she seized the nettles in her hands. The nettles, they broke her flesh and burned her skin. Her fingers were blistered and sore, and she did not make a sound, and she did not say a word. She crushed those nettles in her hands until they were soft enough to weave. Her brothers came back to the cave that night, and when they saw her bleeding, blistered hands, the youngest brother fell on his knees before her and wept, and when his tears touched her hands, they did not hurt quite as much. But not one sound did she make, and not one word did she utter. And the days went by, and the young princess, she crushed the nettles in her hands. She wove the shirts. It was a long, laborious process. Years went by as she made the shirts for her brothers. It so happened that one day, while her brothers were gone, the king of the kingdom came riding by the cave where the young princess sat. And so frightened of him was she that she climbed up into the branches of a tree. And the king was taken with her. He saw her in the branches and he was moved by this wild girl that lived in the woods. And so he ordered his men to bring her down from the tree. And he took her back to the castle, and though she fought and tried to escape them, she was unable to do so. But she was frantic. She did not speak. She did not make a sound, but she was frantic, and that was hard to miss. And so the king went back to the cave, and he found the shirts that the princess had been weaving, and he found the pile of nettles and the beginnings of another shirt, and he gathered up all that was left there, and he brought it to her in the palace, and she was overjoyed to see it, and fell upon it, and began to work, and could not be moved. Well, she was moved, for she was married. She was married to the king. much to the disapproval of the king's cardinal, who felt that this strange wild woman could not be quite human and therefore did not have a soul. And he filled the king's ear with stories of how this young woman was a witch, that she was obviously an enchantress, and that the king should have her burned and free himself from this terrible marriage. The princess, she was a good wife when she was not crushing nettles in her hands and trying to weave the last shirt for her seventh brother. She ran out of nettles. She did not know where to find any more. And it was only by chance that she discovered that the only place the nettles grew close to the palace was the graveyard. And so that night, in the middle of the night, the young queen drew on her cloak and she went out to the graveyard, and there, among the spirits of the night, she gathered nettles into her cloak. And it was there that the cardinal saw her. And it was there that he brought the king to see her. And it was there that the cardinal convinced the king that the young queen was a witch and deserved to be burned. The king was heartbroken, but it seemed there was nothing he could do. And so the decision was made, and the queen was brought out in a wooden wagon to be brought to the center of the square, where she would be burned at the stake. And even as they brought her through the streets, she had 6, almost 7 shirts on her lap as she frantically tried to finish the 7th shirt. And they reached the stake in the middle of the square and the pile of wood around it. And as the people gathered around the wagon and said, "She is a witch! She is a witch! Look what she does! Look what she does! Take the enchantment she is making in her lap. Take it away from her." And they surged around the cart to pull the shirts away from the young queen. But as they did, 7 wild geese flew down from the sky and landed around the queen on the wagon, and the people drew back afraid. And as the queen was taken to the stake, the wood, the dry and dead wood around the stake, it burst into flower. And the people said, "She is innocent. She is innocent," but they only whispered it. And the young queen, she gathered up the 7 shirts, and she tossed each one over a goose. And as she did so, the wild geese changed back into her brothers. And there they stood tall and straight. And she said, "Finally, I can speak. I am innocent." And the king, once he had heard the story, did not burn his queen. The cardinal was not so lucky. And her 7 brothers, the enchantment on the 7 brothers was broken. Except for one, the youngest one. For despite her best efforts, the queen could not finish that last shirt. And there was one sleeve missing. And the young prince, for all of his life, had one arm. It was the wing of a goose. Sometimes it's swans, sometimes it's geese, sometimes there's 6 of them, sometimes there's 12, sometimes it's ravens. You know, it depends on what you want.
Well done.
I felt a lack of closure on the wicked stepmother.
Yeah, where'd she go?
Well, you know, in some of the stories, she doesn't really go anywhere. She just disappears. The story's over once once the princess leaves the palace. Her part in the story is gone. She doesn't come back. In some versions of the tale, it goes on much longer because in some versions, the prince's mother, the king's mother, is not happy that he's going to be married because it makes her position at court less powerful. And so when the young queen has her first child, the queen steals it and smears the queen's mouth with blood and puts blood into the cradle and accuses the queen of eating her own child. And the king refuses to believe it, and the queen gives the mother gives the baby to a servant and says, you know, take it into the woods and kill it. But the servant can't do it, so he takes the baby home to his wife instead. But it happens again, and it happens again. And finally the king can't deny what has happened to his children. His children are all gone. And so we move into the burning her at the stake part. And it's the queen, it's the king's mother it's the queen mother who gets staked at the end.
Well, I personally would thank you for sparing us the blood and guts portion.
It was too long. I think it's too long. You know,
Yeah.
And I have other reasons, but yeah. So sometimes it's geese, sometimes it's swans.